So welcome everyone to this week's POLSIS research seminar. And as those who are regular attendees will know, this is the venue where we bring together kind of top researchers either from within the school or from outside. And it's a great pleasure to have Professor Brian Head here to speak to us today. I think it's important to know this is a little bit of a celebration because this marks Brian's entrance to the corridor to the POLSIS community. We haven't had a chance to celebrate that this year. So Brian's been connected with the school but been based in the Institute until beginning of this year. But it's been terrific having him parked in the corridor here. So it's great to have him presenting today. I think the question that Brian's going to talk about, which is wicked problems, is particularly important. Having just returned from a research committee meeting where we talked a lot about the impact agenda, and one of the things that's becoming clear as the wicked problem of impact is not actually impact itself, but it's going to be the extraordinary bureaucracy that is being built up around impact and navigating that bureaucracy. But it's great to have Brian here. Brian has had really a huge impact on political science in Australia over many years. He's one of the relatively few political scientists, leading political scientists, who's spent time in government as well as in the academy. So he has a particular vantage point from which he can consider these issues. There's very wide-ranging issues across governance and public policy, Australian politics, and also an early interest in political theory, which every now and then we manage to bring to the surface in our discussions. So I'm going to hand it over to Brian to discuss wicked problems. And thank you.
Do I have what?
40 minutes.
40 minutes, okay.
35.
35. Okay. Wicked problems. I was talking to someone a moment ago who was saying, I talk to public servants, and even the public servants are talking about wicked problems. And it reminds me of Paul Keating's joke about fads and fashions in management, where every parrot in the pet shop is spouting the latest management philosophy. And there's a little bit of that in wicked problems. I can't remember when I first came across the phrase, but you all know in this room that it goes back at least 40 years. And I've been playing with it seriously for about 8 years now. And a lot of the times I have the taxi driver conversation with people about what wicked problems are, I have to spend too much time talking about it. No, it's not the wicked camper vans, and it's not a wicked chocolate cake, and it's not something groovy that's on the internet. It's something else. So I had the I suppose pleasure of talking to Kevin Rudd when he was Prime Minister about whether he thought that wicked problems was a good analytical framework. And I used to work for Kevin in the early 90s, as some of you know, and so I was able to ask him this question, and the answer was, no, we use different language. We talk about systemic problems, not wicked, because the moral loading of a phrase like wicked is just too difficult to deal with. So if you want to cut through on something, you say it's systemic or difficult or challenging or some other metaphor. So it's a metaphor. And one of the things I'm going to talk about, if I give myself enough time, is just a little aside about where the phrase came from. The guys who invented it, Rittel and Webber, taught at Berkeley in the 60s and 70s through the 80s. And they were teaching in an urban design and architecture faculty. And it was basically dealing with the problems of urban planning. And the things that were on people's minds in the late 60s and early 70s were things like, how do we deal with riots in our own cities in the US? The summer of '68 was a big conflagration, as most of you know. I've actually got a picture about that later, if I get there. And this was the kind of intellectual turmoil, I suppose, and ferment around how do we deal with complex things, because the assumptions that if we have more knowledge we can solve problems was falling to bits. And that's really my starting point. So let me start off by suggesting to you that in Jurassic Park, in the real Jurassic Park, before humans prowled the earth, we didn't have wicked problems. Wicked problems are an invention of the human species. They are about how humans perceive and deal with things that demand attention. They are not, nothing is inherently a wicked problem. It's all about perception, it's all about interest, it's all about a sense of the level of difficulty, like diving off the 10-metre board with pike and twist. So my little joke here is that it's feral but not wicked. And I use the word feral because if you read the 1973 article, they talk about problems being feral and wicked. And the metaphor is about how you tame a wild beast. That's where it comes from. So feral and wicked is coming out of the menagerie of dealing with the difference between civilization and control and order and capacity to understand and respond to issues, and the bubbling, chaotic worlds that human beings observe and try and get some understanding of, but recognise they can't control. So that's just sort of like the background. Here's a different landscape. Shanghai super city, one of the world cities where the metropolitan region has something like 35 million people. This is full of wicked problems. There's no dinosaurs, but there are lots of wicked problems. And that's the kind of landscape that Rittel and Webber are talking about. They're not talking about the feral animals of the Great Plains before the meteor. So one of the really nice metaphorical contrasts that I've come across in my academic life is the metaphor or the paradox about the moon and the ghetto. And again, this comes from the same period. In 74, an economist called Richard Nelson wrote a really nice little article in the same journal as Rittel and Webber's piece, What Policy Sciences. A year later, this guy didn't refer back to Rittel and Webber, but he was talking about how we have, as social scientists, an aspiration to know and control what's going on in the world, but we seem to be failing badly. And the contrast was with the fairly recent experience of the Apollo mission to the moon. And so his article is a reflection on how come we seem to be good at solving massively difficult technical problems, but not so good at dealing with problems of human behaviour and human interaction. So is putting the man on the moon a wicked problem? Well, Nelson says no. It's actually a massively expensive technical project. It required a lot of things to come together, massive coordination, political will, finance, engineering, iterative problem solving, because they didn't get it right the first time, as you all know from the history of NASA as an agency. But then the contrast then is with what's going on around the corner in our own cities. You know, we're blasting off from Cape Canaveral in Florida and doing fantastic things in outer space, but at home things are going pretty badly. This is not Syria, this is USA, and the cities in '68 were erupting with various kinds of social movements, political protest movements. It's only a few years after the Civil Rights Act, the big debates of '64, '65. So there's a lot going on, and it hasn't been solved. The word solved is one of the key, if you like, what's the word? I can't think of it. It's kind of like a litmus test of whether we're talking about wicked or something else, because the language of solving something is a language of engineering, according to Rittel and Webber. Okay, I'll keep moving because I won't get through. I was playing with a couple of models for how we think about problem solving, and when I got my most recent ARC project on complex problems, and this is kind of like a bit of a report card on where I've got to over a couple of years. Josh Newman and I were doing a lecture on wicked problems for my master's policy course, and we were playing with this kind of notion of taking Rittel and Webber and then turning it into more common sense language. So the left-hand side of the board is the so-called linear problem solving that everyone's familiar with. It's a bit of a straw man, but it's a good heuristic. The notion is you find a problem, you work out what it's about, what its dimensions are, its nature, you define it, you then select a solution from options according to what it is you're trying to do, and then you go out and execute, as they say these days, rather than implement. I prefer implement myself. And there's lots of examples of big projects that have ended up being more or less successful because there's been that bringing together of expertise, finance, political will, and sufficient support for it to get through and deal with all the issues. And a lot of our language around IT and innovation is partly in that mode. It's all about can you as a 17-year-old, can you design an app that will make you a billionaire by the time you're 25? It's that kind of thinking. On the other side is the social problem solving, which is about human behaviour, it's about social organisation, it's about collective goals and collective methods to solve problems, ranging from nuclear disarmament, humanitarian intervention, through to how can you stop too many kids being fat. It's the whole lot. To the extent that it's about behaviour, it's about expectations, it's about capacity to influence, capacity to set policy objectives that are capable of being implemented, then this stuff on the right, the non-linear, is like a swirling, iterative, circular, zigzagging kind of picture, if you like, of what's going on. So there's always debate about what's the problem, about what solution, about whether implementation's going well, about the unintended side effects, the externalities, and so on and so on. And we have heaps of those, and that's what Rittel and Webber are talking about. Okay. So I'm playing with a sort of notion coming out of that there's a lot of administrative and technical things which we sum up as managerialism, which is 80% of what we do. And we try and tie things down, we try to turn them into routines of one kind or another, we turn them into programs, we turn them into educational curricula, training courses, we bed them down, we normalise them in the strict sense of normalise. The other kind of thing is where we can't sensibly adopt that approach. We therefore need to be adaptive, we need also to be collaborative in the sense of reaching out and drawing on a range of expertise and a range of perceptions in order to, if you like, muddle our way towards an acceptable pathway. We're not solving it in a strict sense. I won't spend time on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, but I think it's a nice teaching heuristic. I asked my master's students, is this a wicked problem? Was it ever a wicked problem? And they have a chat about, well, is engineering enough? In this particular case, it had a happy ending, in the sense that apart from the guy riding across and cutting the ribbon before the Premier did, the technical side of it went pretty well. In those days, we didn't have quite the social movements we have now in terms of the so-called NIMBY stuff about tall suburbs being disrupted and all the benefits going to economic elites and all that sort of stuff. So the background intellectually to wicked problems is the critique of rationalism. It's the critique of the hubris of social planning and comprehensive blueprints and problem solving based on data, deduction, consideration of options, using cost-benefit tools, and lining up the resources required to push something through. And so there's a lot of debate in the 70s and of course ever since about whether that kind of measured, knowledge-based, expert-driven approach is ever going to be satisfactory or ever enough. Now the fact is that it is still very common, and it's extremely common in authoritarian regimes. I can't talk about the world today, though I'm having a go, but you find that in some countries that's fine. That's absolutely fine. You know, we have a 10-year or 15-year economic plan. Here are the big signature projects we're going to do. Here's the money lined up. People are being held accountable for implementing it, despite whatever the population might happen to think, despite the externalities and so on. So that kind of model of rationalist blueprint, top-down, expert-driven stuff is still very, very common. We live in a bit of a lacuna here where we take seriously the notion of civic participation and people having rights and sophisticated feedback mechanisms and so on and so forth, holding elites accountable. There are several versions of the critique of rationalist planning that are occurring at this time. The Rittel and Webber is only one of several. I say at the bottom of that slide, there's a whole lot of constructivist critiques coming through, which you know extremely well in this room. There's also the Wildavsky type critique coming out of public administration and public management saying, if you set up an ambitious program to solve a massive problem, then it's always going to fail in terms of the initial ambition for all kinds of reasons, including the ones he's drawing attention to are the massive knowledge base that you would need, which never exists, and the massive coordination requirements to get all the stakeholders and, in a case of shared responsibility, getting all the people to work together in an effective way, singing to the same hymn sheet and so on and so on. And then there's the Thatcherite small government, critique of Keynesianism, crisis of big government, which we still see with the Tea Party and all kinds of things. So that purely ideological kind of thing is also there, and they all get twisted and intertwined at various times. So Rittel and Webber come along and say, hey, we've got to find some way of cutting through and provoking some new thinking. And to me, the 1973 article is a provocation. It's nothing more or less than a provocation to make people sit up and say, hey, all the assumptions we've been making about the problem-solving capacity of ever-increasing knowledge and our rational democratic systems, all these assumptions really are quite dubious. They are rhetorical, they are important for legitimacy, no doubt, but at the end of the day, analytically, they're very dubious. And the 10 features, you know, most of you have read this and puzzled over it and scratched your head about it, but I won't go through any of those, you'll be pleased to know, because A, you've read them, B, they're actually too hard to unpack. The language is quite obscure. For teaching purposes, I rather like the Australian Public Service Commission report from a few years ago, which tries to put it into common sense language. It's in the list of references on the last slide if you want it. And basically it says these are problems that are difficult to define because they are contested and contestable. There are many, in terms of causality, no one quite understands the patterns of causality, it's too complicated. There are many interdependencies, there's too many moving parts to ever be sure you understand what's really going on. The proposed measures or ways forward, solutions, may have unforeseen effects because we don't understand the system. There will always be side effects, there will always be externalities of some kind or another, and that suggests all kinds of ways of having an adaptive point of view or mindset when you're trying to approach these sorts of questions. The problems may keep moving, they do, they keep moving. They won't bloody stand still. By the time you've gone away for a year to scratch your head and have a consultation, you come back and it's shifted again. And this is very typical of many of these kinds of issues. No single clear and correct solution. The solutions are contested. They will always be contested. That's in effect, an endemic feature of wicked problems. Because hypothetically, if we all agreed miraculously that this is the nature of the problem, and here's the nature of solving it, and here's how to do it, and we provide the resources and the goodwill, and we go off into the sunset, it's no longer a wicked problem. in these terms. It's become routinised, it's become settled, and it's not that chaotic, controversial system anymore. So you can domesticate it, but you can't domesticate it through the use of science. Problems are socially complex, many stakeholders, that's a big thing, divergent points of view, many interests to trade off, very hard to get everyone at the same table agreeing on what the situation is and how to approach it. Responsibility is either absent or contested or stretched over an obscenely large number of organisations and stakeholders. So coordinating them and getting them on the same page is practically impossible. And the APSC makes a nice update point that a lot of the ways forward actually require humans to change their behaviour. It's not just a legislative model that you put in a new law like the Civil Rights Act and that solves the problem of racial discrimination. It's saying we actually need to follow up with much more sophisticated second and third layers of activity, but having locked in point one, which is the legislative change, which sends a symbolic signal, you then have changed the platform or the terrain or the landscape in which these problems are being tackled. And you may have to then put your effort into behavioural change or normative instruments and so forth. I won't go through these are obvious. There's 100 issues. A lot of them are in global and international level, which I've snuck in down the bottom because I know it's a mixed group. I don't purport to understand the world. I find it difficult to understand Brisbane. But I do play with some of these issues, particularly around the climate change issues and a bit of stuff on the foreign aid because I'm interested in program evaluation. And I have a bit of an interest in multiculturalism and migration as well. But there's 100 examples, and the literature that uses the phrase wicked problems has mushroomed like topsy since, particularly since the 90s, but more particularly in the last 10 years. I've said that. I'll say a bit more about this. So, how do we think about doing something about a wicked problem? You say, this is a shitty problem, it's important, how do I do something about it? And the fact is that governments and other stakeholders are engaged with these things all the time. They are not a tabula rasa, they are not a no-go zone. They are in fact heavily militarised, if you like, in terms of the battle of ideas and the measures that are already in place to pacify the controversy or to in some way routinise or regularise the conflict, take some of the rough edges of it, if you like. Coercion, dot point one, is, I think, a highly favoured approach. You can imagine your own examples for that. Denial of responsibility is also a favoured approach. It's someone else's problem. Or it's ungovernable, we don't want to go there at all. There's a conversion process in point 3 here where I'm saying that in many cases, from an institutional point of view, what we see, the helicopter view is what's happening over time is people are trying to normalise, institutionalise, routinise some elements of the wicked problems in order to make them more manageable. Doesn't mean solving the root causes, but it means picking bits that we think we can deal with and doing something about that. Ideology is incredibly important. I've talked about that. And I'm suggesting that in the most recent literature over the last 10 years, almost everyone is saying some version of collaboration, adaptive management, iterative and learning approaches are the way forward. This is a little heuristic I did a few years ago for students saying, well, what's it all about? They'd say, what's it all about? Do we have to really go through Rittel and Webber's 10 points? It's too hard. I said, well, it's actually, where some things kind of accumulate and it's almost like a centrifugal kind of effect where you have complexity, uncertainty, and conflict. And where you've got those things becoming intense, that's what wicked problems are about. And a lot of people then say, well, I can't do all of that at once, I'll start to pick a part of that, like, so the knowledge people start with the uncertainty, so we do more science, and so on. The conflict resolution people work in the divergence box, and so on and so on. This week, wonderful example in the Australian, my favourite source of information. The Centre for Independent Studies put out a report saying we'll all be ruined, Indigenous affairs is stuffed, and all this wasted money, $6 billion a year. What do we think we're doing? And if you did a news media analysis over the last 20 years, you would find this comes up all the time, and not just the week that the annual reporting on closing the gap occurs. This happens all the time in terms of various right-wing ideological groups jumping on the bandwagon and saying all this social welfare stuff, it's soft. You don't know what we're doing. We're wasting taxpayers' money. And they usually say rather than we should halve the amount of money, they usually say we should only support programs that have strong evaluations where we can show massive benefits. That's another talk. I'll do something on that next year. So the dilemma for people like us is, can better evidence produce better policy? Now, straw poll, well, of course it can. And how could you do better policy without better evidence? I mean, it's a no-brainer, so to speak. But the fact is that for wicked problems, it's a little bit more complicated. And it's complicated for 4 reasons, which I've put down the bottom, summing up a couple of other ARCs I've been working on. On the one hand, there are certainly problems about knowing what's going on. And some of it, fortunately, is the known unknowns. It's not just total mystery of unknown unknowns going to crash us all the time. The role of knowledge in driving policy is also undermined by the inevitable clash of values and interests and stakeholder perceptions. This is an irreducible fact of public life, and no matter how much information we might have out there, that's not going to change very quickly. Thirdly, unclear institutional roles. Who's responsible? Do they have the capability? Blah, blah, blah. And politicisation of policy frameworks, which I've talked about. So, in the remaining 10 or 15 minutes, I want to raise a different question. The academic discussion of this is now starting to say, well, we spent 20 years trying to prove to people that there was this stuff called wicked problems, but unfortunately now everyone's gotten onto it and everyone's saying that everything's wicked. And this is a bit of a problem. And it is a problem because on the one hand, we can't, as Hobbes said, you can't legislate for the meaning of words. If you could do that, you could control the world. Anyone who can find the source of that quote, by the way, please let me know.
Brian's not here.
I've been looking for it for 35 years. I came across it.
It's a wicked problem for
you. Yeah. But it can be solved with data.
Not so far.
No, not so far. Still working on that one. Part of the problem for intellectual discussion of wicked problems is that the term has got out there. Everyone is using it, as Paul Petty was saying. And so one of the things I'm doing with a few colleagues is trying to say, well, maybe it's not just a binary choice. Maybe things aren't just wicked or not wicked. Because that's really where it started off back in 1973. It's kind of like a threshold effect where, oh my God, that's wicked. And that's where the stuff about admiring the problem in my title comes from. Sort of saying, oh my God, it's so incredible, what can we do? And then you go through phases of paralysis through analysis and admiring the problem because the more you know, the more you realise you don't know, so you just keep on going and it becomes a life's journey. So John Alford and I are developing some sort of theory about contingent approaches. And we're basically saying, look, there's a few basic parameters here we need to distinguish in order to have a sensible discussion of any kind whatsoever. Some of it is about the nature of the actors involved. How many are there? Do they tend to agree or disagree? Stuff about is the problem itself broadly understood or heavily contested? Think of an issue like poverty or equality. Galley's essentially contested concepts comes back to mind on that kind of thing. Is there a good level of knowledge or not? Is there deep fragmentation about the need for action, and if so, what kind of action? And John and I have been playing with a little diagram which you don't need to really understand, but just indicate that, agree that we're working on it, and we'll let you know when we've solved the problem. But one axis is about the complexity of the problem itself and the perception of the complexity, and then the other one is about the problem of the stakeholders and the institutions. Now, I don't have time to run through this, and that's not really the point of the talk, but basically you can start with tame, settled, controllable problems in one part of the axis, and we go out into outer space with wicked and super wicked problems of various kinds, because to the extent that neither the problem nor the solution is clear, we're in a bit of a no man's land where it's very hard to have a sensible argument, except sort of megaphones at 20 paces. And on the fragmentation issue, institutional fragmentation, that's equally an issue. So too many clicks. So you end up with a complicated diagram, and you don't need to worry too much about that. Basically, John and I are working on it, and what we're trying to do is to say, if we want to develop a more nuanced view of what are the key dynamics going on in a field that we're calling a complex or wicked problem, we need to start mapping, if you like, a spectrum of possibilities based partly on what's going on in the stakeholders' heads and partly about the institutional arrangements and partly about the knowledge base and so on and so on. The other thing is language about solutions. Now, I threatened to take my clothes off before, but I am actually going to strip at this point, because when John Alford had a birthday recently,
I'll just turn the recorder off. Camera on.
I made up some t-shirts. And we walked around the party wearing these t-shirts because we had this nice article in a nice journal, but it was totally ironic. And the whole point is that if you see people saying that they are solving wicked problems, they are bullshitting. So the new stuff, the new thinking on this is that we try to have self-discipline, and we try to adopt more muted language, if you like. We're talking about a more pragmatic approach. We're talking about managing, tackling, addressing, rather than solving. And the problem really is that in common parlance, people want to hear that we're fixing something or solving it. If you study the rhetoric of politicians, I hope this is your next book looking at you, we'll pick this up. I mean, the language of fixing and solving is massive. And the language of academia is actually more nuanced. And we're full of caveats about, under what conditions something might possibly be fruitful for someone out there. Sometimes what we're calling success is not solving. It's actually something like stopping something getting worse. And I've spent 20 years working on environmental problems, and a lot of the practitioner discussion in the environment sphere is about stopping things getting worse. It's not about going back to some golden age where the dinosaurs were, feeding on the plains. It's also about something really important for most of us, I think, these days, which is about laying the groundwork for future useful considerations and deliberations. So it's a process thing. It's about capacity building. It's about metaphors about building platforms and scaffolding, and it's about putting ourselves in a better position to do more sometime soon, perhaps with new partners. And determining what isn't working is useful. So the Centre for Independent Studies has a certain place on some things, possibly. And then my last couple of slides, because I want to finish in the time allotted. This is a purely academic point. Let's learn. Let's do some research. My current ARC is supposedly about how policymakers have been trying to address, not solve, address complex problems in Australia and elsewhere. And if you say, well, what kind of knowledge would be useful? Well, part of it is let's invest in more program evaluation. That's a very sort of internal to government kind of conversation, which I have also written about separately. But I think comparative case analysis is a good place to start, and everyone in this room can get to grips with why that counts or could count for them. So I think one form of learning is comparative case analysis, and some of that needs to be longitudinal, because the whole argument is that wicked or complex or intractable problems have an evolutionary history that is really, really important. And if we don't understand that, we are really whistling in the wind or just plucking down some ideological panaceas. Even on mega projects like the Three Gorges Dam in China, or the Sydney Harbour Bridge, or whatever it happens to be, the Channel Tunnel between France and England. Pick your example. Some of them seem to go reasonably well because there is goodwill and a degree of legitimation around what's going on. Others are imposed on populations through a top-down process, which history will mark people down for. But at the moment, say, an economic development goals seem to be more important than anything else, so that trumps the other kinds of things. And in authoritarian regimes, but even in lovely countries like Australia, where we look after all our people, we sometimes do that. The war on drugs is something that John Alpha and I have been playing with as an example of something. Seems to be a good example of a wicked problem that is really out of control, and where different approaches are on display on the front pages of the press all the time. One thinks of the new president of the Philippines, who promised to kill 100,000 drug pushers in his first term of office. And the public opinion polls are saying that 2/3 of the population has trust that he will do that. Now, I might have misinterpreted something, but that's one end of the spectrum. You think of all the Hollywood films about Mexico and drug barons and so on. This is all part of that. How on earth do you deal with that? Even just thinking about safe injecting rooms in King's Cross in Sydney, or whatever it happens to be. The debate on guns is an interesting one. Josh Newman, who some of you knew, he was here for 18 months recently. We did a paper on gun control, and the message was it's a wicked problem in the USA for all kinds of reasons. It's not so much a wicked problem here. And being able to tease that out through comparative case study with Canada as a third example is the sort of thing I'm talking about. So you can contextualise things in a more nuanced way, and saying, well, here's the conditions under which things are possible, dreams are possible, progress is possible, and so on and so on. So in conclusion, a cheap shot, only humans generate wicked problems. humans are the main cause of human misery. Apart from the asteroid that is about to reach Earth quite soon. That's some reading, and there's the Wicked Van looking at the Jurassic Park.
Is that you?
Yeah, it is actually, yeah. Because when I was younger, I could grow a moustache. And that's it, thank you.